Guys, welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. Today is going to be a fun episode. I actually have Jim Heffelfinger and Rana Tucker from the Arizona Game and Fish Department. Today we're going to be talking about Goulds turkeys. We're going to talk about how they got to Arizona, how they're doing now, about the hunts that we have for them, and all about Goulds turkeys. So Rana and Jim, I'm happy to have you guys on here. Welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, Jim, let's starting out. I'd like you to kind of give a little introduction and also introduce Rana and her role. I believe she took over your position some years back, and just kind of give us the listeners who haven't heard you on my podcast or other podcasts, tell them a little bit who you are and who you guys are, and we'll start there.
Okay, sounds good. First of all, I'm the proud holder of a Gould's turkey tag this year in the Chiricahuas.
Come on, good for you. I didn't
Yep.
know that. Fantastic.
Yep. So my season starts May 8th, and it doesn't mean that I work at the Game and Fish Department, so I get a Gould's tag every year.
I can attest to that because you've been on a dry spell for some time.
Yeah, I have. And I'm leaving Friday on a junior turkey hunt with my son up in Unit 23. So I've got another turkey tag in between those two with my other son, so I'll get a little bit of turkey hunting in this fall.
Fantastic.
So I've been, I started with the Game and Fish Department in the Tucson region in 1992, coming over from a master's degree in South Texas. And I was for 22 and a half years the regional game biologist, called the regional game specialist in the Tucson region. And we started, we'll talk a little later after introductions about the history of restoration of Goulds, but we started thinking about getting Gould turkeys back into the Sky Islands back then. And throughout my 22 years, that was part of one of the things that I was involved in. And about 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, about 4 years ago, I moved to a statewide position called Wildlife Science Coordinator, which is a Phoenix-based position. I still live in Tucson. My position's based in Phoenix, and I just provide science support for the department, make sure that the decisions we make and the policies we have and management decisions have a good, solid scientific foundation. And so when I left the Tucson regional office as the regional biologist for Southeastern Arizona, Rana took over my old position. So I'll let her talk a little bit about her background, but just to let everybody kind of understand who we are in the department and what we're working on.
Thank you. Rana?
Sure. So I came here from Nebraska about 6.5 years ago or so. I used to specialize in bighorn sheep up in northwestern Nebraska and was a technician up there. I originally moved down here to take a position with the landowner relations program at the department. So that gave me a lot of really good background on the area and the different wildlife and habitat to use, and also working with private landowners and land managers, at least a lot of the public lands down here. So I was just pleased as punch to get into a different position within the department. I love working for the department here, where I could focus a little bit more back on wildlife management itself and actually doing some hands-on work with the different species.
Well, it's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. And, it's going to be an awesome conversation this day to talk about the Gould's turkey. It's an animal that I've gotten to be very, very fond of, and they're just an amazing animal. So it's awesome to have both of you on here. One of the things I'd like to do is basically let's start at the beginning. Jim, you had mentioned the reintroduction program and mentioned that there was, a few turkeys, I believe before we went on live, that, there was a few around at Fort Huachuca, but there was a major effort that was going to be put forth to basically bring the Gould's turkeys back. And now here we are, fast forward, we have Gould's turkeys in just about every Sky Island mountain chain there is, and have hunts in just about, and you can correct me, in just about every historical mountain range in southern Arizona. So from a turkey hunter, someone who's a turkey fanatic, it's an amazing story. For someone who's a NWTF member and proud supporter of what the National Wild Turkey Federation does, it's an awesome story. But also as an Arizona resident and just my love for the state, I think it's one of the most fantastic things that the Game and Fish has done, among a lot of other things as well, but it's one of the great stories. So why don't you take us back to the beginning, and let's kind of start there, and we'll move forward.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think a lot of people don't really have an understanding of the history of Gould's turkeys in southeastern Arizona and why we have Goulds in southeastern Arizona and we have Miriam's up on the Mogollon Rim. If you look at the archaeological record, I don't want to start too far back, but if you look at the archaeological record, there isn't really absolute proof that we had Gould's turkeys in these Sky Islands. They were all gone soon after the turn of the century, like a lot of our wildlife were just overexploited, maybe some poultry diseases in some places. But these mountain ranges were empty in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. So the Game and Fish Department went up into northern Arizona and brought Miriam's turkeys down into these mountain islands in southeastern Arizona and released them. Admittedly, small releases. They didn't pour a lot of turkeys in, so there could have been some genetic bottlenecking with just a handful of turkeys being released in some of these mountain ranges. But they did that in the 50s, and by the time we got to the 70s and 80s, they were pretty much all gone. They just didn't do very well. And looking at the ecology of southeastern Arizona and the Sky Islands, they're really more connected with the Sierra Madre in Mexico. If you think about Miriam's turkey and cow's whitetail, and a lot of species that are tied to that, what we call the Madre and oak woodland in the Sierra Madre that comes up into the Sky Islands. We thought as the Game and Fish Department and others that probably the Gould's turkey was the native animal in these Sky Islands. And so we started thinking about bringing some Goulds from Mexico, and that they might be better adapted to these arid southwestern mountain ranges with less water and just the environmental conditions much more similar to Mexico. And so in the mid 80s, working with Fort Huachuca really led an effort to bring some Gould's turkeys in. So if you think about it, all these mountain ranges were empty, except a few of them had a few remnants of Miriam's turkeys from the 1950s. And Huachuca's was one of those mountain ranges that had just a few turkeys in a few pockets here and there. And so the Game and Fish Department and Fort Huachuca brought in 1983, they went and caught 17 birds in Mexico. And because they were poultry and coming across the international border, they had to be quarantined for 30 days as part of the agricultural rules. And after quarantining 17 Gould's turkeys for 30 days, only 9 of those survived. So in 83, they released 9 birds in Fort Huachuca. In 1987, they brought in 29 more birds from Mexico, quarantined them again for 30 days, and only 12 of those 29 survived. So they released 12. So we only had 21 birds released in the mid 80s in Huachuca's.
Jim,
Fort Huachuca.
Real fast,
Mm-hmm.
was there a pretty good sampling of males and females in that, or was it a predominantly females and only a couple males?
No, at that time it was pretty good. It was the first 9 birds. The first 9 birds was actually 9 females. So they released 9 females, and then 4 years later had to come back in and get some males in there.
Yeah.
So the ones that survived. And so the one in 87 was 5 males and 7 females. So they got some males in there. So you think about from the mid 80s, you've got a population that's starting with no more than 5 males total.
Right.
And a few more females in there. And so they limped along throughout the late 80s and early 90s and really didn't increase very fast. And so in the early 90s, our small game supervisor, Ron Wilson, started talking to some contacts in Mexico about bringing some more birds in the 90s and starting to restore Gould's turkeys to these mountain ranges in southeastern Arizona. So in 1993, we went down there, and I came on board in 92. So I was part of that first translocation in 93 where we went down into Mexico and used drop nets. And we couldn't use traditional rocket nets or drop nets because they use gunpowder, and we couldn't be bringing gunpowder across the border. And so we had a mechanical device that you pulled a string, like an old Wile E. Coyote Acme company trap. You pulled a string, and this drop net, this mechanism released all the corners of the drop net, and it fell straight down on the birds like a little net circus tent. So we had those down there. We set those up. In 93, we captured 12 birds and brought them across. And the significant thing was at that time, our small game supervisor, Ron Wilson, was able to negotiate not quarantining for 30 days. and bringing them across. And that was really significant because we knew how many we were losing in quarantine. And so in 93, then we captured 21 birds, including 9 jakes and 12 females, and brought them across without quarantine. We released them in the Galeros, and we actually had James Earl Kenhammer there from National Wild Turkey Federation at the time, because this was a big deal, a big historic translocation to new mountain ranges. And the Galeros, truthfully, in hindsight, really wasn't the best mountain range at all, but at the time we felt it was farther away from any poultry operation that might cause a disease concern. And that was the original justification, and we released them in the Galeros then. But within a year, 18 of the 21 that we released were dead. So they did very poorly at that time in 94. And we since then have started we continued to work and brought a few other from Mexico. We brought some over in 97 and 2000, 2002 and 2003, and then really started having populations in the Chiricahuas and the Huachucas that were doing well enough that we could use birds within the country to help populate some of these other mountain ranges. And we focus most of our sources in Arizona to help repopulate other mountain ranges. And we also, I mentioned that the Huachucas probably had a few Miriams still walking around in there from the 1950s when the fort brought those birds in the 1980s. We later went back with the geneticists, collected a whole bunch of samples throughout the Huachucas of turkeys, and did genetic analysis. And there's some genetic markers that clearly tell Gould's turkeys from Miriam's turkeys. And we're able to document there was no evidence of Miriam's turkeys in the Huachucas, in that Huachuca population. All the genetics was 100% Gould's turkeys there. So that was important too, to know that there was always that suspicion that maybe some of those resident Miriams contaminated that gene pool and they weren't pure, but we were able to document those were pure. And then so starting at that time, me as a regional biologist for Southeastern Arizona, we started having a multi-agency, twice a year we would meet, and it was the Southeastern Arizona Wild Turkey Working Group. And we would get together in December in the middle of summer, and we had Forest Service, we had BLM there, we had National Wild Turkey Federation, local representatives, the chapter. There are 2 new chapters that were developed in Southeastern Arizona. And we all got together and collaboratively talked about what habitat projects need to be done, where do we need water, where do we need to clear some brush in the bottom of canyons, and what birds were going to be translocated from where to where, because we had these mountain ranges that were still empty at the time. And so we would meet twice a year, and we, throughout about 2 decades, progressively captured birds in one place, moved them to the other, and restored Gould's turkey populations. The National Wild Turkey Federation, local chapters, did a ton of work volunteering, doing spring gobbler surveys with us, covering a bunch of the Huachucas first, and then some of the other mountain ranges that we still do, and putting in habitat proposals through our Habitat Partnership Committee to get funds to do habitat improvement works and burns. And so throughout the last several decades, we've worked on habitat and worked on turkey restoration. And now, as you said, we have Gould's turkey populations, and we're hunting Gould's turkey populations in every one of the traditional Southeastern Arizona mountain ranges. We also have turkeys in riparian areas and other places that they were historically along river areas. So it's really rewarding to look back and look at all of those people that worked so hard to bring Gould's turkeys back. And even more rewarding when you get a Gould's turkey tag in your pocket and you can go hunt the birds that you had a hand in helping to restore back into Southeastern Arizona.
Yeah, I've got to imagine that's super rewarding for you. I believe you had another Gould's tag, so I think this is your second Gould's tag over the course of 20 years, isn't it?
Yeah, now it's going to really sound like it's rigged. I did have a Gould's tag, and I did have a Gould's tag in the Catalinas in 2014, and that was really special because I have a son who really got me into turkey hunting when he was really young, and he went hunting with me, and he called this bird in and got this gobbler to turn and come back over a ridge, coming back towards him, and which gave me the shot. And I shot it with my great-grandfather's 1897 L.C. Smith side-by-side, which is a double trigger, double hammer Damascus steel shotgun that a friend loaded some 5-shot with black powder so it was safe for the Damascus barrels. So it was there was a lot of neat things. My son calling the bird in, hunting a population I helped restore using my great grandfather's old Damascus steel shotgun. Really neat.
Fantastic, for sure. So there's so many questions I have. One would be just off the top of your head. I guess at the top of the list of questions I have are, what would you say as far as population, you guys, which mountain range has the most Gould's turkeys right now?
I think that would be a good question for Rana, because Rana, those twice a year meetings that I talked about that continue to guide Gould's turkey management, even though we've done a good job of repopulating mountain ranges, Rana still runs that meeting and has for several years, twice a year, and continue to talk about habitat improvement, continue to talk about, are there areas we want to move some Goulds, and coordinate spring gobbler surveys, not in every mountain range, but in a lot of them. And so for the management aspect of it, Raina's the contact for that. What would you say, Raina, for
Sure, I can jump in on that. So based on our spring surveys that we do in the mountain ranges, Jim mentioned that we have huntable populations in just about every mountain range down here. If you count those up, what we have right now are 7 different ranges. And of those 7, the Chiricahuas and the Huachucas have the most birds. The Huachucas, we had a really great survey last year, surveyed 335 turkey and Huachucas. The Chiricahuas we did not survey last year, but the year before they counted 219. So if you look at like the 5-year average, we're looking around 200 birds on average in the Huachucas and 150 in the Chiricahuas observed. That's not the total population, that's just what's seen on survey with the survey route.
Sure, that's fantastic. And what would you say out of the 7 ranges, what would you say, which range has the least amount of population?
You know, it kind of depends on how you look at it, because we can split out mountain ranges like the Patagonias, but they're also pretty interconnected with the Huachicas. We maybe don't see as many birds there. The other mountain ranges kind of average around 60 birds or so, and they're pretty equal across the board. I think the distribution across those ranges are all a little bit different, and that's why you'll see different numbers in permits, and also the numbers of toms and hens across there. But on average, there's around 60 or so that we see on survey.
Okay, another question I have is, it sounds like early on there was a bunch of birds that came from Mexico. I'm curious if they came from Chihuahua or northern Sonora. Do you know that, Jim?
Yeah, the first 9 jakes that we brought over in 93 or 94, I pulled the string to capture those birds, and then, so I don't make myself sound like a hero, I have to admit that the guy that was laying in the blind with me had to wake me up and tell me that there were turkeys under the net, and then I should pull the string. So full disclosure on that one, but those birds came from just east of Yekara up into the mountains, and so we were based just outside of Yekara.
Yep. Right on the Sonora-Chihuahua border then?
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Yep. Right on. If you look at the border between those states, there's a little kind of a crooked spot on the border, and it's right near there. I think later on in the early 2000s, there were negotiations with the Wing Shooter Lodge in Chihuahua. You might be familiar.
Yep.
With them, and I don't know for sure where the birds came from there, but I remember they were talking to the Wing Shooter, and I think we had some birds come from Chihuahua later on.
Okay, good.
We're Zacatecas, Jim. I've got Zacatecas.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good.
Spreadsheet, but I don't know where that is, so you'll have to get some frame reference.
Yeah.
And then you guys have been able to supplement from Arizona, from, Huachuca and the Chiricahuas now into other ranges. Is there any anticipation of any more transplants or anything on the books, or is it more of a, maintain what we have and just kind of keep track of what's going on?
It's a little bit of both. We try to maintain what we have out there, what we know of them, trying to identify new places where birds are existing and we could maybe add to those populations. We are working on identifying new places that are appropriate for birds as well. We do want to be a little bit cautious in jumping in and putting turkeys in places that maybe they won't do as well. And so the studies like the one that Brian Wakeling did on the Galeros, comparing them to the Huachucas, that kind of information is really crucial to us. And also the study that was done just recently in the Huachucas and the other mountain ranges with backpack birds. That kind of information on their habitat use will really help us guide our decisions about where we might want to place birds in the future. We are working on expanding the population in Mule Mountains right now, which is a smaller range. But it's good habitat there too, and across part of the range. So
so the Mule Mountains, I'm familiar with those. Are there any other mountain ranges where you guys as a department have your eye on that there is good habitat and should be birds other than the mules?
We haven't looked too heavily into that at the moment. We've kind of discussed, Jimmy, you'll have to help me out, 3060, northwest of Nogales.
Yeah,
I don't spend a lot of time in there, so.
Yeah, we've had a few turkeys make it all the way over the Babakibri, across the Altar Valley where the Buenos Aires Refuge is, up into Browns Canyon. Those are just a few strays that went over there. The Atascosas Mountains down by Nogales, west of Nogales, they have turkeys in them that are connected to Mexico. There really isn't. We've got turkeys in there, Vipa Canyon in that riparian area. Other than the mules, I don't think there's any other mountain ranges that don't have Gould's turkeys. Maybe the Dos Cabezas.
What about the dragoons?
Yeah, those are kind of low. They could get turkeys come in, especially in the riparian areas and roost along riparian areas. But I don't, they just don't have the pine component up with a lot of roost trees up high. And the dragoons and Dos Cabezas are probably in that group too.
What have you guys found is the single biggest threat to the Gould's turkeys in this whole restoration project and now having the ability to hunt them in all these different units? What is the single biggest threat?
Well, I'll let Rana think about that. I would say environmental variability, droughts, impacting reproduction and impacting mortality. We don't really have a disease issue like you might in southeastern United States, where you've got a lot of farms and a lot of poultry here and there. We just don't have much of that in there. We're finding out that roost trees aren't as limited as we thought they were. They just roost everywhere. There's water sources that, really aren't bad in most mountain ranges. And as you heard from Mike Chamberlain, they'll just go to the bar if they get thirsty, roost over the bar over in Rodeo, New Mexico.
That was amazing.
The funny thing was all the comments on Instagram of people who actually knew where that bar was.
Yeah, that was an amazing story, tracking that bird and how she just traveled all around in the Chiricahuas and headed over to the bar and roosted there for a couple nights and then headed back on. That was crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if your listeners realize Mike didn't really mention it, but when Mike Chamberlain was on for that 2-part series recently on this podcast, he's been a collaborator in this Gould's research in the last several years. We put GPS backpack transmitters, like he was describing, on Gould's hens to get a better idea of their timing of their reproduction and their movement and the roost sites that they used. And Mike Chamberlain and Brett Collier from LSU were full collaborators on that. I don't think Mike really mentioned that much about how much Gould's work he was collaborating with us on.
I found his conversation to be very fascinating. He's really into turkeys, and it's been very well received by people. That's one question that you ended up answering for me was when those Gould's turkeys first hit the nest and when the incubation period is. Kind of like to dive into that a little bit, and because it kind of all ties in with the timing of the seasons and when is a good time to be harvesting birds, and when they've had a chance to reproduce and all of that. So, and I know even after my podcast, I had a few people ask me, when is that, when do the studies show that the first Goulds lay the first egg, and then when do they show the main incubation periods?
Yeah, and it gets confusing when you start talking about that, because people start talking about when they start nesting, and that's kind of a general statement. You have to clearly talk about nest initiation, which is normally thought of as when the hen lays the first egg, because of course the hen will lay an egg in a nest and then walk around, and then each will lay one egg every day until the clutch is complete, and it's usually about 12 or 14 days. And so one biological benchmark that biologists talk about is nest initiation, and that's normally when they lay their first egg. And then the other thing is when incubation starts. And so they'll lay one egg a day for 12 days. And then when they have their full clutch, then they start sitting on the nest and they don't move. That's the initiation of incubation. So you kind of have to be clear about what you're talking about, because there's 2 weeks difference in that. And traditionally, turkey biologists just had VHF backpack transmitters, and those are the ones that just send out a radio signal, no GPS on board. You use the big antennas. You've seen probably people pointing an antenna in different directions, and when you're pointing right at the bird, the signal's the loudest through your headphones. That's the old VHF signals. And at that time, when we just had that technology, biologists were locating hens really at most once a day. And so you're not going to catch when a hen drops an egg and then walks around, and then the next day drops an egg. She's walking around for most of the time, and you're not going to even determine when she's starting to drop eggs, because she's pretty much walking around. And you're not going to catch her on the nest like you do with a GPS transmitter that collects a signal every hour. They can even do it every 15 minutes if you want. Then you see when they return to that egg, and then they return to the nest and drop an egg. And you can see them coming to that one spot at least once every day, and you know they're starting to initiate the egg laying. And so there's those two things that biologists talk about, is the average date when hens are dropping the first egg, and that's nest initiation, and the average date when they sit and they start incubating. And that was always obvious no matter what kind of technology you had, because that's the day that the hen stopped moving for 28 days. And they'll incubate for about 28 days, and they'll just sit on that nest. And so no matter what technology you have, it's pretty obvious that she's on a nest. And they get up and they move around. I think Mike talked about it. They do the little forays and they feed and get a drink of water and come back, but they're mostly on the nest. So traditional harvest, what biologists traditionally tried to do to time the breeding season was to time the breeding season so it opened on the date of nest initiation. And years ago, they didn't know when they started laying eggs, so they were kind of talking about incubation years ago. So ideally, if you start the hunting season when all the hens are average peak of incubation, then you've got all these males running around. You've got the females that are sitting on nests. They're not going to be walking around. Sometimes there's concern about females getting accidentally shot in that spring season. The turkey hunter, I'm not sure how that happens unless it's a bearded hen, of course. And that's a real low percentage, 1-4% of the population. But you want to time that season so that you open it ideally when all the hens are sitting on nests, or the peak of nest incubation. But that doesn't work out very well, because if you're opening the season that late, you can miss a lot of the calling activity. In some years, the hunters may miss almost all of the gobbling activity. So that's not good from a hunter perspective. And so biologists have said, well, maybe not opening the season the average date of nest incubation, but 2 weeks prior to that, the average date of when they start dropping their first eggs. Let's shoot for opening the season at that point. And that way we'll have females near the nest dropping eggs, and you still catch a lot of the gobbling activity at that time. And so that was kind of the goal. That's what biologists were striving for once that information came out. But hunters want to have seasons when there's the peak of the gobbling activity, because that's when it's funnest. As a hunter, your satisfaction is tied directly to how many turkeys you see, how many gobbles you hear. And so hunters want that a little bit earlier than biology would dictate. And so some states, and Mike talked about this, have kind of inched their seasons a little earlier in the calendar to maximize hunter enjoyment and hunter satisfaction. And so as a state agency, you have to balance this, what's best for the bird so we don't potentially impact breeding and reproduction, and what's best for having a good hunting season. Being on either end of the spectrum is not good. Having hunters not hear any gobbles is not good. And killing birds a lot earlier before the actual breeding gets done is not good either. So agencies are always trying to balance that. And I think I sent you the paper that resulted from this Goulds research that we had with hens, where the average nest initiation, when the average date that on the average hens are dropping their first egg, was May 17th. And so we're looking at those seasons. We knew that Goulds were later than our Miriams. Our Miriams average nest initiation up on the rim was about April 30th. And we've known that for a long time after some research Brian Wakeling did for our research branch. So April 30th, and then we have the hunts for Miriam's up there starting not even a week before that, and on May 1st this year. Mm-hmm. The Miriam seasons up there on the rim start April 24th this year and May 1st. And so that's right at the peak of when they're starting to drop their first egg. So that's timed really well for Miriam's up there. With Goulds, we knew it was later. And so we actually, in the last couple of years, we've been cheating our guidelines and going outside of our guidelines to actually hold the hunting seasons a little bit later than our guidelines say, because of all this, what we're talking about. We don't want to have them too early for Goulds, and we know that they breed much later. And now, just in the last year, this research has been published, and we have the final results. And where we stand now, even cheating and having our seasons a little bit later for Goulds, we're still about 1.5 to 2.5 weeks before the peak of nest initiation. And so it's something that we as an agency, this is all brand new information, so we're talking about that, about should we shift that a little bit later in the season to accommodate the birds biologically, but we don't want to shift it too far late in the season where we ruin everybody's hunt and they're not gobbling. We've already got hunters saying it's too late. You need to shift the Goulds earlier because they're gobbling more earlier. We're trying to balance biology and sociology on this.
Yeah, and
so we're pretty close.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead,
yes.
Rana.
Can I just jump in with a comment with that? One of the things that makes scheduling these hunts really difficult is that our guidelines have a schedule that's dictated. It'll say we want it to start on Friday at week 17 or week 18. And even though we went outside of guidelines and pushed it forward into week 17, we're also dealing with a calendar ratchet year. And so when you look at which week of the year that week 18 or 17 is, it's just the way the calendar falls. And so our hunt recommendations and packages have been set for this year and next year. So it'll be the year after that before we are able to adjust that a little bit and see where that week 18 actually lies in the calendar.
Yeah, and I was thinking when Jim was talking as well, not only do you have those guidelines set years in advance, I think it's, needs to be noted that the season always starts historically in Arizona. Most all seasons start on a Friday. The only thing I can think that at the top of my head that doesn't, it's just random on December 1st is bighorn sheep. But, our deer hunts, our elk hunts, our antelope hunts, the turkey hunts, they all start on a Friday. So I can see from the Game and Fish's perspective when they're trying to balance all this that you guys are talking about, not only that, when you have, week 17, week 18, whatever it might be, you've got Friday and Friday. Well, from a biological standpoint, it might be great to say, let's just bump it back a couple of days. Well, the reality is, because of tradition, you can't really do that because you also try and make the hunts that coincide with weekends for hunters so that they can actually hunt over a weekend as well. So, I know you guys have a lot to juggle, and I know that sometimes you guys face criticism for having seasons early, late, and not just turkeys, but there's a lot to kind of balance in there. And you take the fact that you want to start those seasons on a Friday, that also plays into it. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot of moving parts, but that's a good point. Adjustments are only going to be made in 1 week increments. So
right.
We'd go a Friday earlier or a Friday later. And Rana was talking about what we call calendar creep too. So if the season opens on Friday the 24th this year, it's going to open on Friday the 23rd next year, and Friday the 22nd the next year. So it creeps through the calendar, and then every 7 years, it makes a 7-day jump back. And so it kind of creeps one day at a time, and then at one point it jumps like a week back. And so when we talk about when the season dates are, that season date, like the Goulds hunt starting May 1st this year, that week opener on that Friday is going to vary between April 30th and May 6th throughout 7 years.
Right.
And so it's actually moving by itself. And then the other important thing to think about is we talk about the average date of the first egg lay and the average date when they start incubating. Research shows us that in a population, if you graft all the females the day they laid their first egg, there's a 2-month variation.
Yeah.
It's a bell-shaped curve, and
Sure.
they're laying their first. Different females are laying their first egg over a 2-month period, and so we talk about the peak. So in some respects, it's kind of like measuring with a micrometer and then cutting with an axe. We talk about this date and where we're precisely going to have the hunting season in relation to that date, and the females are spending 2 months laying their eggs. It's not a precise date. And so the best we can do is I think the concerns Mike Chamberlain had about being way too early, but 2 things. One, there's some southeastern states that are like 3 and 4 weeks early. And so that's way different than what we're talking about, like a week and a half or 2.5. Then the real important point, and I've talked to Mike in the past about this, is the exploitation rate, or what percent of the gobblers are we really killing? How hard are you hunting them? And as Rainey talked about, we over 200 birds in a couple mountain ranges, and those mountain ranges have 24 tags or 30 tags. We're hunting them so extremely light. And Mike Chamberlain himself has said, you're closer to an unhunted population as far as when they're gobbling. And so we're hunting our Goulds in Arizona so conservatively that that's a whole other dimension. It probably doesn't matter when the timing is so much, just because we're hunting them so conservatively.
Yeah, and one other question I would have is some of these ranges, like the Huachucas, like the Chiricahuas, when Rana mentioned those are, the 2 probably with the most, heavily populated, there's a 2-hunt structure. So there's a first hunt and a second hunt. And there, from my perspective, from a hunter's perspective, in these ranges, with the amount of campers and recreational vehicles and stuff, there's also a period of time there and geographic place where it seems like every flat spot, there's Gould's turkeys, but there's also people camping there. My question is it ever been talked about in some of these units that have a ton of birds to go to a 3-hunt structure, or would it always be just increasing the number of tags for each of the 2 hunts rather than go to a 3-hunt structure, or 3 timing of season structure, if that makes sense? I want to take a second here and thank the sponsors of the podcast. I want to thank GoHunt.com, my friend Cody Nelson, the glassing guru. He's the optics manager at GoHunt.com Gear Shop. If you have any optical needs at all, give Cody a call directly at 702-847-8747. You can also send him an email at optics@gohunt.com. You can also text him at 602-399-3699. I want to thank Go Hunt for their sponsorship. Also remind you guys we're in application season. The Go Hunt Insider is the best Western hunting resource tool out there. It's got the best draw odds and harvest statistics available. You can go to gohunt.com/JScott. Just by signing up, you're going to get a $50 Go Hunt Gear Shop gift card. I want to thank gohunt.com. I also want to thank KUIU. That's KUIU. KUIU Ultralight Hunting, KUIU.com. KUIU is the gear that I wear on all of my hunts. Phonescope.com, I want to thank them. Use the JScott20 promo code. You're going to get a 10% discount on all orders. OnXMaps.com, use the JScott20 promo code. You're going to get a 20% discount on all orders at OnX Maps. And then ApexMunition.com. Apex Ammunition, it's the home of the TSS, the Tungsten Super Shot. That is the shotgun shells that I'm going to be using on my upcoming turkey hunts. Go to apexmunition.com to find out more. Guys, let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, we actually do have that option within our guidelines to add that 3rd hunt. We always consider hunter access and hunter crowding when we write our recommendations, in addition to the density of birds and the numbers observed, and also the hunt success every year. So we actually have been discussing that in recent years, since most of the bird populations do seem to be growing, especially within those 2 major mountain ranges. And we are looking at that, if we can, increase by just a couple tags, but then maybe redistribute them throughout the 3 different seasons, so that way there's not as many people in one place.
Yeah, and we did that in 33 this year. So we've got 3 different hunts with 3 tags each in the Catalinas.
Okay, I I didn't see that, but that's good. And one of the ranges I've hunted quite a bit is the Catalinas, and it gets a little, gets a little clogged up. Whereas I would think a
Yeah.
3 hunt structure, 3 tags, that would spread it out a little bit.
Yeah,
That's a huge challenge that we face down here in southern Arizona. Is we have a lot of public land, but the access to them is somewhat limited. There's only so many roads that go in that the public can use, and so even though it seems like a huge mountain range and there's a lot of places for turkeys to be, the access points are kind of limited. So we have to do the best we can to get people to distribute, through time, if not across space.
Yeah, I was wondering, Jay, whether you had experience in 33, because when I had my tag in 2014, I went up and spent a day riding with the wildlife manager, because through our managing that population and other populations, he had always talked about how many areas there are off limits because of cabins, occupied hard-sided structures, the quarter-mile radius, and the ski valley up there. And I was always trying to get him to add some more tags because the resource was there. We could let more people Goulds hunt in Arizona. And he was always complaining about the access. And so I rode with him for a day, having some incentive because I had a tag in there, of course. But I rode with him a day up on the mountain range, and it really opened my eyes. I was astounded how difficult it is to find areas that you can hunt that are more than a quarter mile from a hard-sided structure. And I actually killed my bird on the Bigelow Road out to Mount Bigelow. And there's a hard-sided structure at the beginning of that road. It's only a couple miles long.
Yep.
And there's some cabins at the end of the road. And I killed my turkey in the middle. And I mean, another quarter mile either way, and I couldn't have been able to shoot a turkey. So it really is difficult in that mountain range, and that we have those issues in all other mountain ranges, that we could have a lot more Goulds tags for people, but it's just really hard to put people in there and have places to go, have places to shoot turkeys.
Well, and speaking of 33, you guys also here in the last couple of years, I know Dar's son had it a couple of years ago, the south of the Reddington Road, I believe, the archery only hunt, which I think was created because of the situation of private property. You thought, man, there's a ton of birds down here, but there's really, when you start trying to get boots on the ground and start measuring, where can someone actually legally shoot a bird, I would assume that's what led that to creating that archery only unit there south of Reddington Road in Unit 33, is it not?
Yes,
it started out as a shotgun, right?
I'm not sure.
But that's another area where we have three seasons, over there on that side of Reddington Road too. The archery hunt is 3 seasons with 1 tag each. And go ahead, Raina. There's some private land there, I think, was where the turkeys always are, as I understand.
Yeah. And so we were able to get hunters in there if it was just archery only, because the folks that lived down there were comfortable with that. They were not comfortable with folks shooting shotguns, and you can't in that area because of the legal restriction. We may butt up against some challenges now that we've also passed the quarter-mile archery rule as well, so we'll just have to see what the birds do and where they go in that area, because there is a good population down there. Just how far are they going to range from the ranch houses and the resources and stuff available there.
I guess the next question I would have for you guys is, how much more do you see the Goulds expanding, and how much capacity? I'm sure it's different from range to range, but I mean, is this one of those things that you're hoping, when maybe the 3 of us aren't even here anymore, or when we can barely walk, that all of a sudden, there's just widespread Goulds turkeys, and, they've got 3 or 4 different seasons, and, or are we at a capacity level where it's, you guys are comfortable with where it's at, or is it at a capacity where it could double, and wouldn't that be great? Where are we at?
I've seen in my 6 years down here in this corner of the state and the work that I used to do, I've seen a lot of habitat manipulation going on, both by private landowners and interested NGO groups. The Turkey Federation has been very active down here in doing habitat projects, and the Forest Service has really started the ball rolling on doing some large-scale habitat improvement projects, such as brush management or prescribed fire. And I could see that continuing on into the future and continuing to improve habitat and connectivity for these birds. And so I could see them growing as long as the resources are there. We do face challenges with drought and there have been some advancements made with different types of treatments. Quail Forever has been really involved in the Fort Huachuca area, building these one rock dam structures that are just a series of a single layer of rocks across washes that are meant to slow the water as it goes through and increase infiltration, which can improve food resources. So it's pretty labor intensive, fairly expensive, but you can get a lot done and across the landscape and have a big impact there. So I'm seeing those becoming a little more popular down here as well. And I think the more of that is done and the more people work together, I think the more chance we'll have that we'll see those populations increase.
Yeah, the National Wild Turkey Federation for decades has put a ton of labor and money into habitat improvements in Fort Huachuca and all these other mountain ranges too. They deserve a lot of credit as conservation partners for us.
That's great. And I've got a question about Jim. You were talking about that time period when the hens first lay their egg, but I don't believe, and maybe I missed it, the incubation period. And you also pointed out that hens across the board in Arizona have a 60-day, a bell curve on one end, on the other it's 60-day time frame. But when is that incubation period? I'm kind of hopping back to the biology section. When is that incubation period? And you mentioned that they sit for 28 days. And in those people that are listening to this podcast that didn't listen to Mike Chamberlain's 2 episodes where we talked about predation of that hen is super, super high when she's laying for 28 days. I kind of want to go back to that period. So you said May 17th is the average when their Gould's turkeys are laying their first egg. When is the incubation period?
The average incubation would be about the 29th, May 29th.
Okay.
So it's pretty consistently 12 to 14 days later. So if you just take 17 and add 12, and I have all the individual dates from all the individual hens here. It's just not averaged, but on the average it's 12 days after initiation. So it would be lay the first egg on May 17th, and then the average incubation on the 29th. And then the hatching date's about 28 days after that. So the range in hatching dates from the hens that we had successfully hatch a nest, the range in hatching dates was June 16th through August 6th.
Interesting.
August 6th is really late. That may have been, when I looked at that date, I thought, I wonder if that was a renest. I wonder if that was a failed nest, and then she renested, because that's so late. So if you throw out the August 6th, then the next latest is July 12th. That's probably a better number. It's probably like from mid-June to mid-July is when they're hatching.
It's something that's jumping out in my mind when you say those dates, being someone that, from Arizona here, and, it totally corresponds with our monsoon rains, which normally start around the 4th of July to the 15th of July, right in there. Do you think that's not a coincidence? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Same with if you look at our deer, our fawning, the peak of whitetail fawning is first week in August. Mule deer a little bit before that, but early August in mule deer and mid-August in whitetail. And like you say, that's no coincidence. You get summer rain starting July, you get the green up, and so now you have fawning cover after a few weeks after the monsoon start. You got fawning cover, you got nutrition for the lactating doe, and it's the same thing with turkeys and turkey poults. They need that green vegetation and need the insects that come with the monsoon rain. So that's exactly why Goulds coming from the Sierra Madre and southeastern Arizona are timed that way. That's what drives getting those young ones to survive at the best time of the year, drives the evolution of the timing of the breeding season on anything.
Another thought that came to my mind is the fact that Arizona, and I'm curious how it stacks up against any other state, we actually have 3 species of turkeys. We have the Merriams, the Goulds, which we've been talking about, the Merriams, in primarily the central and eastern part of the state and even up on the Kaibab, but then on the north of the Colorado River on the Arizona Strip, we now have Rio Grande turkeys. I'm just trying to think in my mind. I think we've got to be the only, I shouldn't say the only state, but with 3 species of turkeys, but there can't be many states that have have all three. I mean, I can think of Florida with Eastern and Osceola. I can think
There
of
can't
Texas
be.
with Eastern and Rio. I can think of Washington with Rio and well, Washington may have Rio, Eastern, and because I've heard they have Easterns and Merriam, so we might be tied with Washington. But it's interesting that Arizona, as arid of a state as we are one of the states that has three different types of turkeys.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before. And why does Washington have Easterns?
I don't know the answer to that, and I could
For
be
the same
wrong,
reason.
but I've
For the
always
same
heard.
reason Arizona has Rios.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard that they actually have Eastern turkeys as well, and hopefully the people from Washington can correct me, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. And let's just take a quick break here to ask Jim. Rana, you may not be familiar with it as much as Jim, but feel free to chime in. How is our Rio Grande turkey population doing north of the Colorado River?
Yeah, Raina, if you know that, you can take it because I don't have.
I got nothing.
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Sorry,
9 hours from us.
Out of my region, I don't know.
Okay. When I look at the tag numbers, it looks like that they're doing well because it seems like they're been increasing and keeping the tag numbers the same. So I guess that's another podcast for another day and talking about our Rio Grande turkeys. But I do think it is fascinating that a state, when you mention to most people, they don't even know we have mountains and pine trees. They think we're all just a big desert, but we have three of the turkeys. It's pretty neat.
Yeah,
it really speaks a lot to the diversity of our state and the different types of habitat you can find here. I was amazed when I moved down here. You can drive 2 hours in any direction and find yourself in a completely different environment, and so it just supports a good variety of wildlife and makes it a nice place to hunt.
That's for sure. All right, guys, so with the Goulds seasons coming up here, obviously the start date of May 1st for the Goulds, I think from everything we've been talking about from a biological standpoint, it's a great start date, especially for the birds. And, normally where the success rate on Goulds, I don't know the exact figure, but it's super, super high, probably compared to even Merriam's. From a perspective of trying to keep our Goulds as healthy as possible, I think, having this May 1st start date, I think is fantastic.
Yeah, another thing about you mentioned, we were talking about the 3 hunts that are available, and they're used currently only in Unit 33. When we add that third hunt, it comes before the first hunt in all the other units. And so because of our harvest is so low, it's really not an issue biologically, like we were talking about disrupting the male hierarchy that Mike Chamberlain was talking about. It's not really an issue biologically because, like in Unit 33, we've got 3 tags in each hunt. But one thing to keep in mind, if someone really likes that idea of spreading out the number of tags instead of in 2 hunts and 3 hunts, because then you have less competition while you're hunting, one thing that does is it moves it now 3 weeks ahead of nest initiation. It's kind of going in the wrong direction when we had that third hunt. And as I said, our harvest rate's so low, it's really not an issue with Goulds, but it's another thing to think about. We're getting farther away from that.
Well, it's something to keep your eye on that, you don't get a few years down the road and you look back and go, gosh, this third hunt is a great idea, but we've now been harvesting, and maybe it does at some point, get into harvesting too many birds and too early. So, I definitely think it's something to think about, but that's a good point that you talk about the third hunt structure and it actually goes in the beginning. Rather, I would just think it would start and then go, at the end. So that's a good point. And, something else. Go ahead.
Sorry, another point to make, too, is that we don't have to distribute the tags equally between those 3 hunts. We could do, if we need to add that third hunt, we could have a smaller number of tags in that one just so that the impact is a little bit less during that critical time period, and then just use the other 2 for the remainder.
Yeah, and it's funny, too, about talking about turkeys. From my perspective, if you're talking about deer or bighorn sheep or elk, things like that, a lot of times I'm not a huge proponent of the 2-hunt structure because of what I see out there as a professional guide and out there in the field is it puts a ton of pressure on the resource. I think when you're talking about Gould's turkey, where it's few tags and the success rate is so high, that you could get away with doing a few more seasons and going with more of kind of a hunter enjoyment, better experience. Whereas I think if I've ever been critical of units for deer or elk that turn into a 2-season hunt structure, or even sheep, we could talk about some of the stuff, in 37A, I believe, where it's like, yeah, but, you get a whole new group of hunters that comes in and they're just gung-ho and they're just hammering the resource. Then, if you put them all in at the same time, most hunters go for 2 or 3 days and they never go again. And, they go the first 2 or 3 days and then they're gone. Whereas if you do a double hunt structure, it's a fresh group coming gung-ho, bang, bang, bang. And, so that I've debated that on this podcast as well. We don't need to go into that, but I'm just curious your thoughts on that, Jim.
Yeah, I think like you said, with Gould, it's not an issue. People are going in and probably, Rana may know this, but probably the average days per harvest of a Gould turkey is probably 1.
Yeah.
So they're going in, they're shooting a gobbler, and they're gone. I never thought about that, but I can see your point. If you have 3 back-to-back bighorn sheep hunts and each tag holder has 30 people glassing, there's a lot of people out there in the field.
Yeah, and I think on the deer hunts as well, where it's, lots of camping, lots of ATV riding, lots of, disturbing. I think that's a fine line. But again, that's a whole nother conversation. Anything that you feel like we're leaving out about a good Gould's conversation, or anything you guys want to bring up, I think now is a good time for that.
I have a question for you with your experience in northern Mexico. You're in Chihuahua, right? You're not in Sonora?
So I do.
Where you doing most of your hunting?
I do northern Sonora and northern Chihuahua both.
Okay. What's your thoughts? Do you have a feeling for peak of gobbling activity? Another piece of information too that from all that research Mike Chamberlain and Brett Collier and a lot of their graduate students were involved in is people talk about, well, the peak of gobbling is here, or there's a bimodal peak of gobbling. They gobble a lot with the breakup of the fall flocks, and then they gobble a lot at the nest initiation. When that group there, University of Georgia, started really looking fine scale at gobbling. Remember, he talked about those automated gobbling detectors, just
the frequency
sound detectors.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he can go in and strip out just that gobbling frequency. Probably get some car door slams and some coyote calls in there too. But you look at the gobbling. Yeah, but if you look, they've got some graphs of like, here's 2015. Here's the number of calls they detected each day throughout the whole season. And so you can see if there was a peak in gobbling activity, and then the same area the next year, same area, and you look for a peak in gobbling activity, and it's different. So whether there's a single peak or a double peak is really variable. It's really difficult to define. It's not just simple as saying the peak of gobbling is here. But I'm curious what your thoughts were, because I'm sure when you want to have most of the clients down there because of gobbling, because they're just going crazy. Yeah, I'm wondering when that is.
Yeah, when I see, so this Mexico's a little up in the air whether I'm going this year or not. I've canceled my April hunts, but still hoping to do maybe a couple in May. We'll see. But this would be my 11th season down there consecutively. So for the last 10 years, I've been able to sample pretty good that exact question. And what I always tell people, and a lot of people from the East and the Midwest, they scratch their head and they're like, come on. I say they gobble as good the last day as they do the first. And I really don't notice a big difference. And that would be a question I would kick back to you. So I don't notice a big difference of on the limb roosted gobbling in the morning or on the limb roosted gobbling in the evening from, say the 3rd week of April when I go down there to, say, mid-May, about a 3-week period from, say, April 20 to May 15th is kind of the window when I go, and they seem, from my observation of just listening, to gobble the same on the limb. Now, I will tell you, gobbling on the ground, they seem to gobble a little bit more throughout the day in the earlier part of the season as opposed to when it gets a lot warmer in May. So I wonder if the temperature, on say May 10th has more to do with them not gobbling at noon as opposed to April 23rd when we're out there and it's cooler and they're going to gobble more during the day. So from a behavioral or biological perspective, I don't know the answer. I can just tell you that roosted birds, they seem to gobble exactly the same from the first time I go down there to the very last hunt. They seem the same. But from a temperature standpoint, I have seen, those really warm days in May where they kind of shut down, if you will. They'll still gobble. They'll still come into a call, but they may not hammer and gobble quite as much as they would have, the 24th of April. So I would kick it back to you and say, is that a behavioral thing or is that a temperature thing? That they're just, they're hot and they're loafing around and they don't want to gobble.
Yeah, I think the gobbling being more consistent in the roost makes sense to me. There's more behavioral stuff going on there. The gobbler is announcing his presence, and that makes sense that would be more consistent, and it would be less consistent once you're walking around looking for hens, depending on when the hens are nesting, where they are in the nesting cycle, depending on the heat and the weather. It's interesting to me, like I was talking about those graphs, when you look, you can kind of see some sort of peak. You have to really squint and turn your head sideways to see peaks in gobbling when they actually collect real data, like they have with these automated sound meters. And so I think this whole idea of a peak in gobbling is really muddy, and there's so many factors. But one thing I wonder, where you're hunting, there's no doubt that some of the more recent research has shown that when hens start incubating, the gobbling goes up, and that makes sense. You think about, well, now those hens are not walking around, so now there's more males per females available, and so there's more competition. The gobblers might be gobbling more because there's more competition for fewer available females. But at the same time, and this is confounding all of this information about gobbling peak, at the same time, gobblers are being removed from the field.
Correct.
And so you've got less females available.
And have been pressured. So,
yeah, right,
so they've been killed
that's
and they've been removed and they've gotten pressure. So I would say, not to just jump right in here on top of you, but I would love to see that same study on a big chunk of ground on birds that don't get any pressure. And then I would say, okay, now we can look at that and go, okay, this is a peak gobbling time. When, if you're doing a survey and, up on the rim or up in the Kaibab, on Merriam's turkeys, and then all of us, they're gobbling good, and then all of a sudden 600 people roll in. Well, the gobbling meter is probably going to go down because the amount of pressure, and they feel that presence, and no
doubt.
But I think a true study would be on a piece of property that there is no hunting pressure, and just see I would be so fascinated with that.
Yeah, I'll send you the paper
Awesome.
Because the group at University of Georgia has done that on. They're at University of Georgia, but right across the border in South Carolina is the Savannah River Ecology Site, and they've just done decades and decades and decades. It's really a research station for University of Georgia, even though it's in South Carolina. And actually, a friend of mine, Gene Rhodes, is the director there, and doing genetic work and stuff with him forever. But that's not hunted on the Savannah River Ecology Site. So they did a study where they looked at gobbling where there's no hunting at all. And they found that I think a third or half of the gobbling happens after the hunting seasons on other surrounding land that is hunted. After the end of the hunting seasons, in an unhunted area, they're still finding a third to half of the gobbling happening after the surrounding hunting season. And so if it's not hunted at all, there actually a lot of gobbling going on. And where it's hunted in the surrounding area, like Mike said, they're shutting up, and it's both removal of birds and disturbance of hunters in the woods. And temperature, like you were talking about, is another factor, but definitely the removal of birds and the disturbance and hens becoming unavailable. Those are all factors affecting gobbling activity, which is why it looks so chaotic.
Yeah, and I think people listening to the podcast are probably in their minds thinking, well, how does this information correlate to me going up and going hunting, and how does this make me more successful? I think one of the things that we can point out here, and then we'll probably conclude, is in the early season when gobblers are trying to attract the hens, and they're trying to create, establish their hierarchy and the pecking order. You've got a lot of gobbling, and then in that period where, I call the lockdown period, where those gobblers are really locked in with the hens, and it's notorious. Goulds aren't as much because they seem to gobble all the time compared to a lot of birds, but you go back east and other places where guys say they gobbled a couple times on the limb in the morning, they flew down with the hens, they never made another peep. That kind of lockdown period. Then you've got the period where the hens kind of start prospecting for a nest, lay their first egg, and then there's a period where they're, for 12 days, you said, are leaving and going to lay another egg. Well, that's when some of these later seasons, and guys listening, in Arizona, we have a pretty liberal time frame of a season. Sometimes later in the season, as far as you calling as a hunter and making a call, and maybe not having a bird just fire and gobbling the whole way in, but calling birds in late season can be very effective, because those hens are leaving and going to the nest and laying those eggs, and that leaves those gobblers receptive to that calling because the hens are all leaving. Any thoughts on that, Jim?
Yeah, definitely. Counterbalancing that is gobblers getting harvested and taken home. But what you said is definitely true.
Yeah. Anything else that you feel like we've left out here in the Goulds conversation?
I would just close by. Oh, go ahead, Rana.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, you were talking about that period before the nest initiations and the early peak gobbling. There's nothing to prevent them from going out in the field and scouting and figuring out where the birds are hanging out, what they're doing, and then coming back to that area during hunting season. So
100%.
if they want to really hit the peak gobbling, go find them then.
100%. Yeah, I mean, that's, a lot of times these junior seasons, talking about Merriam's hunting, you can get some phenomenal gobbling. One, because I think it's early in the season, they haven't felt that pressure yet. But, I think I tell people on my Instagram all the time, they're asking me, how early is too early to scout? Well, it's never too early to scout. And quite honestly, by April 1st, at sunup and sundown, birds are going to be gobbling from the limb. And it's a great time to be out there listening for birds and trying to establish, roost areas and where different birds are. And leading up to the hunts, that's a fantastic time. And glad you made that point. That's the time to be out there trying to figure out where your turkeys are at. Just listening, marking them down, and moving on, and trying to establish as many roost sites as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, for sure. I would say, despite all of the science that we talked about, if you've got a tag, the more time you're spending out in the field, the better chances you're just gonna get near one of those gobblers that's gonna respond. So don't worry about the science; just get out there.
You guys, it's been awesome having you both on here. I really appreciate it, and I love to hear the passion in both of you's voices about the Goulds turkeys, and just want to thank you guys. Sometimes I'm sure it's a thankless job, and sometimes you don't get the pats on the back and don't get the thanks that you guys deserve. So, I'm saying for a lot of hunters, thank you. For the work that both of you have done with all of our animals, and especially the Goulds turkeys. And I really appreciate both of you carving out some time and coming on here to talk about Goulds turkeys. And just wish both of you safety, and hopefully we can get through this whole COVID-19 mess and get it in our rear view mirror, and hope family and friends and colleagues all stay safe out there.
Thank you very much for having us on.
All right.
All right. You too, Jay. Thanks.
Take care, guys. Thanks.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.